Welcome my channel. Today we're uncovering a forgotten catastrophe from early America that history quietly buried. 1720 Louisiana. The deadliest colonial disaster America forgot. This isn't a legend or exaggeration. It's a reconstruction based on scattered colonial records, ship logs, and survivor accounts that took serious time and effort to piece together. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe to support this kind of deep, true history research. Every story here is carefully verified, cross-checked, and brought back from the edge of oblivion. In the early 18th century, Louisiana was sold to the people of Europe as a dream. A land of endless rivers, fertile soil, gold in the ground, and opportunity waiting for anyone brave enough to cross the Atlantic. This dream was carefully crafted by financiers, crown officials, and promoters who had never set foot in the swamps they described. At the center of it all was an ambitious colonial plan designed not just to populate Louisiana, but to rescue a collapsing European economy. France, burdened by debt after years of war, turned to a bold financial experiment that promised instant wealth through overseas colonies. Louisiana became the centerpiece of that promise. The plan was simple on paper and disastrous in reality. Thousands of settlers would be shipped to the Mississippi Valley, where they would establish farms, trade routes, and towns. Crops would grow effortlessly. Trade with indigenous nations would flourish, and raw resources would pour back into Europe. Pamphlets distributed in Paris and other cities painted Louisiana as a tropical paradise with mild weather and rich soil. Rivers were said to be lined with fruit trees. Wild animals were described as plentiful and easy to hunt. Some even claimed gold dust could be found in riverbanks. For the poor, the desperate, and the imprisoned, Louisiana sounded like salvation. Recruitment was aggressive and often deceptive. Prisoners, debtors, orphans, and even people taken from the streets were offered freedom and land if they agreed to go. Many had no real choice. Others sold everything they owned to buy passage, convinced they were heading toward prosperity. Families boarded ships believing they would arrive in a functioning colony with homes, food, and protection waiting for them. What they didn't know was that the colony barely existed beyond a few fragile outposts struggling to survive. When the ships finally arrived along the Gulf Coast and up the Mississippi River, reality shattered the dream almost instantly. There were no prepared towns, no stocked storehouses, and no reliable infrastructure. Settlers were unloaded into dense wilderness dominated by swamps, mosquitoes, and unfamiliar terrain. The climate was brutally humid, far harsher than anything they had known in Europe. Fresh water was scarce, food supplies were limited, and the soil, praised so highly in Europe, was difficult to farm without knowledge of local conditions. The colonial planners had assumed indigenous knowledge would fill the gaps, but relationships with native nations were fragile and often hostile due to broken promises and misunderstandings. Supplies from France arrived late or not at all, often spoiled or stolen by the time they reached settlers. Disease spread quickly among people weakened by hunger, exhaustion, and shock. Fever, dysentery, and malaria cut through the population within weeks. The ambitious plan had not accounted for medicine, sanitation, or even basic shelter. Leadership on the ground was chaotic. Colonial officials argued among themselves, mismanaged supplies, and ignored warnings from those who understood the land. Orders from Europe arrived months too late to be useful. Instead of adapting, Leaders clung to the fantasy sold to investors and the crown, insisting success was just around the corner. Meanwhile, settlers died by the hundreds. Graves multiplied faster than homes. Entire shiploads of people vanished into the Louisiana wilderness without leaving written records behind. What made this plan especially deadly was not just poor preparation, but deliberate misinformation. Financial interests depended on continued investment and immigration. Admitting failure would collapse confidence and expose the scheme as a lie. So letters sent back to Europe were carefully edited. Death counts were minimized. Survivors were pressured to describe hope and opportunity, even as they buried neighbors and family members. The disaster was being hidden in real time. By 1720, the colony was in full collapse. Starvation forced people to eat roots, bark, and sometimes things far worse. Violence broke out over food. Some settlers fled into the wilderness and were never seen again. Others died clinging to the belief that help would come. The ambitious colonial plan that promised wealth and glory had instead created one of the deadliest settlement disasters in early American history. Louisiana had not failed because the land was cursed or uninhabitable. It failed because human greed, arrogance, and deception replaced preparation and truth. The dream sold in Europe was never meant to save settlers, it was meant to save a financial system. And the people who paid the price were those who believed the promise. The settlers who arrived in Louisiana in 1720 were quickly confronted with a nightmare far beyond what they could have imagined. Disease struck first, moving faster than any army and with far deadlier precision. Fever, dysentery, and malaria ravaged entire groups of people within days. The European immune system, unprepared for the harsh subtropical environment, offered almost no resistance. What few doctors were present had little knowledge of local remedies, and medicines sent from France were often spoiled, diluted, or entirely inappropriate for the illnesses spreading across the colony. Within weeks, families were decimated, and communities that had traveled together from the same ships found themselves reduced to handfuls of survivors. Starvation quickly compounded the crisis. The colony's organizers had promised settlers that the land was fertile and food would be abundant. But Louisiana's soil, heavy with clay and swamp, resisted the European farming techniques settlers brought with them. Crops failed repeatedly due to flooding, heat, and pests unknown to the newcomers. Efforts to forage in the swamps were dangerous. Wild animals, venomous snakes, and treacherous marshes made even basic survival a challenge. Many settlers were forced to eat what they could scavenge: roots, bark, and small game, though hunting was difficult without proper knowledge of the terrain. Starvation, combined with disease, turned the colony into a grim place where death seemed constant and unavoidable. Environmental collapse was another silent killer. The colonial planners had made little effort to understand the region's unique ecosystem. Heavy rains often led to catastrophic flooding, destroying shelters and washing away limited food stores. Hurricanes, though infrequent, arrived with devastating force, toppling fragile structures and scattering survivors into the swamps. Freshwater sources were often contaminated or too far from the settlements, forcing people to drink from stagnant pools teeming with bacteria. The combination of these environmental factors made survival a daily battle, and even the strongest among the settlers began to weaken rapidly. Compounding these natural threats were the failures of leadership and organization. Many of the colony's officers and planners were more interested in profit and prestige than in the actual welfare of the settlers. Supply chains were mismanaged, leaving critical food, tools, and building materials delayed or completely absent. Some leaders hoarded resources, while others tried to impose impossible demands on an already suffering population. Orders from European administrators arrived months too late to be useful, and when they did, they were often irrelevant to the immediate needs of the settlers. Without strong guidance, communities fell into disarray, and morale plummeted. The combination of disease, starvation, and environmental collapse created a perfect storm. Families were torn apart, with many succumbing alone in isolated huts or dying in the swamps while trying to reach safer ground. Infants, the elderly, and those already weakened by the voyage were especially vulnerable. Records and letters that survived indicate entire shiploads of settlers were wiped out in just a few months, their deaths unrecorded and unnoticed by the distant crown. The human toll was staggering, yet the true scale of suffering was hidden by those attempting to protect the colony's reputation. This devastation was not random. It was the predictable result of a plan designed without understanding or respect for reality. Settlers arrived with hope, but the lack of preparation, combined with a hostile environment and rampant disease, ensured that Louisiana would become a graveyard for those who believed in the dream. The disaster was both immediate and protracted, killing not just through direct causes but by eroding hope, community, and trust. By the end of 1720, the colony's population had been reduced to a fraction of its original number. Survivors were sickly, malnourished, and traumatized. The dream of a thriving Louisiana settlement had been replaced by a harsh struggle for basic survival. Disease, starvation, and environmental collapse were no longer distant threats. They were daily realities that haunted every waking moment. In hindsight, the disaster was inevitable. But at the time, settlers had no understanding of the forces arrayed against them. It was a catastrophic failure of both human planning and the unforgiving wilderness. In essence, the suffering of the Louisiana settlers in 1720 illustrates how unprepared human ambition can be against the raw power of nature. Disease, starvation, and environmental collapse acted together to destroy communities, wipe out generations, and leave a scar on history that was so profound it was almost erased. The tragedy was not just in the number of lives lost, but in the crushing weight of hope betrayed. Hope sold to settlers as opportunity, but delivered as an unrelenting nightmare. The disaster of 1720 Louisiana was not merely the result of disease and starvation. It was also magnified by catastrophic failures in leadership that turned an already dire situation into a full-scale human tragedy. The colonial administration, responsible for organizing and supplying the settlers, had little experience in dealing with a frontier colony of this scale. Many of the officials were appointed based on political connections rather than competence, and their priorities often lay more in impressing superiors in Europe than in ensuring the survival of the people on the ground. Orders and regulations were frequently inconsistent, and conflicting directives created confusion among both settlers and subordinates. The resulting chaos left communities without reliable guidance, leaving them to face harsh conditions largely on their own. One of the most glaring failures of leadership was in resource management. Provisions meant to sustain settlers for months often arrived late, spoiled, or in insufficient quantities. Shipments of food were miscounted or diverted, tools and farming equipment were lost in transit, and building materials for shelter were often missing or unusable. Commanders sometimes hoarded supplies for themselves or allocated them preferentially to a favored few, exacerbating inequalities and creating resentment within the fledgling colony. Settlers were forced to improvise with whatever they could find, but the lack of planning meant that many families faced exposure to the elements and had no means to cultivate crops or access clean water. Leadership also failed in planning for the environment itself. Louisiana's swamps, floods, and subtropical climate presented challenges that European officials had either ignored or underestimated. There were no effective flood defenses, no shelters designed for the intense humidity, and little knowledge of local diseases. Commanders had assumed European farming methods would translate perfectly to the New World, ignoring the fact that the soil, pests, and growing conditions were entirely different. Without guidance on how to adapt, settlers' crops failed, and food scarcity became an immediate threat. The combination of environmental mismanagement and lack of local knowledge accelerated the suffering of the community. Communication breakdowns further compounded the crisis. Orders sent from France could take months to reach Louisiana, and by the time they arrived, conditions had often changed dramatically. The messages were sometimes incomprehensible or irrelevant, instructing officials to perform tasks that were impossible under the circumstances. On the ground, colonial officers struggled to interpret these directives while simultaneously dealing with outbreaks of disease, starvation, and unrest. This disconnect created a vacuum of effective authority, leaving settlers to fend for themselves in a hostile landscape where every day was a fight for survival. The human cost of these leadership failures was staggering. Starving settlers fought over limited food supplies, and outbreaks of violence became increasingly common. Disease spread more rapidly without organized quarantine or medical care, and weak or poorly enforced laws failed to maintain order in a colony teetering on the edge of collapse. Families were torn apart not just by the natural dangers of the land, but also by the absence of competent guidance and the absence of trust in those appointed to protect them. Every mismanaged shipment, every delayed order, and every poor decision by the leaders contributed directly to the mounting death toll. Moreover, leaders often attempted to conceal the severity of the situation. Reports sent back to Europe were sanitized or deliberately misleading, emphasizing small successes while ignoring the scale of the human suffering. This allowed the financial and political backers in Europe to maintain faith in the colony and continue sending settlers and resources that were insufficient to meet the growing crisis. The insistence on maintaining appearances at the expense of human life meant that even when relief could have been possible, it arrived too little and too late. The psychological impact of leadership failures was also profound. Settlers had been promised opportunity, stability, and protection. When leaders failed to provide these, hope turned into despair. Morale plummeted, and despair often led to fatal mistakes. People venturing into the swamps in search of food, attempting to walk to neighboring settlements with no guidance, or succumbing to illness without seeking care. The absence of effective leadership created an environment in which fear and confusion multiplied the effects of disease and starvation, turning the disaster into an inescapable trap. In the end, the colonial leadership's incompetence transformed an already difficult environment into one of the deadliest disasters in early American history. It was not just nature that killed the settlers, nor was it simply misfortune. It was the combination of poor planning, mismanaged resources, delayed communication, and a refusal to adapt to local conditions. The disaster serves as a powerful example of how human error and mismanagement can magnify the severity of natural and environmental crises, turning opportunity into tragedy and ambition into catastrophe. The failure of leadership in 1720 Louisiana left a scar on the colony and contributed to why the disaster was eventually forgotten by history. Survivors had little reason to recount the full horrors, and European officials were keen to hide their mismanagement from investors and the crown. What remained were fragmented accounts, scattered letters, and silent graves, all testaments to the devastating human cost of decisions made far from the land and far from the reality of survival. The survivor testimonies from the 1720 Louisiana disaster are among the few windows into the unimaginable scale of human suffering during that forgotten catastrophe. Most settlers who lived through the ordeal were profoundly traumatized, and their accounts reveal a world of chaos, fear, and despair that official reports deliberately obscured. These testimonies came in the form of letters, personal journals, and, in some cases, oral recollections later recorded by historians. What stands out immediately is the raw honesty of these accounts. They describe not just death from disease and starvation, but the constant psychological torment of watching friends, family, and neighbors perish around them, often in horrifying ways. One survivor described waking each morning to the smell of death mixed with the rotting swamp, and the sight of bodies strewn across the settlement like discarded toys. Children were particularly vulnerable, and parents often had to choose which offspring they could attempt to feed or protect, knowing they could not save all. Some settlers recounted scenes of entire families wiped out by fever in the span of days, leaving solitary survivors to care for the sick and bury the dead. The psychological strain of this constant exposure to mortality was as deadly as the diseases themselves, leaving survivors emotionally scarred and socially isolated. Survivors consistently highlighted the collapse of basic social structures. Without functioning leadership or adequate resources, lawlessness became commonplace. Food theft, violent disputes, and desperation-driven crimes were frequent. One survivor wrote of being forced to fight off other settlers for scraps of spoiled provisions, while another recalled hiding in the swamps to escape a mob intent on taking his small ration of rice. These accounts underscore that the disaster was not only a natural calamity, but also a social one, as fear and scarcity eroded trust and community cohesion. Another theme in survivor accounts is the complete lack of medical care. Even basic illnesses that might have been treatable in Europe became fatal in the colony. Fever, dysentery, and malaria claimed lives rapidly, and without knowledge of local remedies or access to fresh water and nutritious food, survival was nearly impossible. One woman recounted nursing her husband through weeks of illness, only to watch him succumb while she herself was near death. Another wrote that the colony's few medical officers were overwhelmed, incapable of treating more than a handful of patients at a time, and often powerless to prevent the spread of disease. The testimonies also reveal the extreme measures settlers took to survive. People scavenged the swamps for edible plants, fished in treacherous waters, and attempted to hunt wild game with little experience or proper equipment. Starvation led some to eat roots, bark, and even animals they would not normally consider food. There are accounts of individuals succumbing to exhaustion or drowning while trying to reach better land or food sources. And these deaths, like so many others, were often unrecorded. The survivors' writings capture the constant tension between hope and despair. Each small success in finding food or clean water was overshadowed by the overwhelming losses elsewhere. Despite the horror, many survivors' testimonies also convey a remarkable resilience. Some recount moments of human kindness, neighbors sharing the little food they had, strangers rescuing children abandoned in the swamps, and small acts of courage that allowed others to live another day. These stories serve as a stark contrast to the overwhelming suffering and highlight the complexities of human behavior under extreme stress. Even amid despair, survivors clung to these fleeting moments of hope, documenting them alongside their tales of death and disease. The testimonies also shed light on the discrepancies between what settlers experienced and what European officials reported. Survivors frequently noted that letters sent back to France minimized the scale of the disaster or painted a falsely optimistic picture of life in the colony. This censorship was deliberate. Officials wanted to maintain investor confidence and protect their reputations. Survivors' accounts, by contrast, provide a candid and often brutal view of life in 1720 Louisiana, showing the gap between reality and the official narrative. Finally, survivor testimonies provide crucial evidence for understanding why this disaster faded from historical memory. The sheer trauma of surviving made many unwilling to recount their experiences in detail. Those who did write or speak often did so years later, their accounts fragmented and sometimes contradictory. This combination of trauma, death, and deliberate suppression of information ensured that the story of the deadliest colonial disaster in Louisiana would remain largely forgotten for centuries. In essence, the survivor testimonies are invaluable not just for the factual details they provide, but for the human perspective they preserve. They allow modern readers to grasp the unimaginable conditions the settlers endured, the rapid succession of deaths, and the psychological weight of living in a collapsing colony. These testimonies remind us that behind every statistic of the 1720 disaster was a human story, a life lost, a family torn apart, and a community forced to confront the limits of human endurance in the face of an environment and leadership that had failed them entirely. The erasure of the 1720 Louisiana disaster from mainstream American history is a striking example of how human suffering can be buried when it conflicts with political and financial agendas. While the events themselves were catastrophic, leaving thousands dead and the colony in near total collapse, European authorities and colonial promoters had every incentive to downplay or conceal the true scale of the tragedy. Reports sent back to France were heavily censored, sanitized, or altered to emphasize minor successes and minimize deaths. Investors needed to believe in the viability of Louisiana, and admitting to such a catastrophic failure would have shattered their confidence and likely cut off funding for future expeditions. The settlers who survived were left without voice, and the stories of their suffering were deliberately suppressed, leaving behind only scattered records and fragmented accounts. One of the primary methods of erasure was through controlled correspondence. Letters from colonial administrators were carefully edited to ensure that backers in Europe perceived the colony as functional. Deaths were reported as isolated incidents or attributed to the hardships of frontier life in general, rather than the systematic failures of planning, leadership, and environment. Successes, no matter how small or temporary, were exaggerated to maintain the illusion of progress. These selective narratives created a false sense of accomplishment that allowed financial and political stakeholders to continue supporting the colony despite its ongoing struggles. The survivors themselves played a role, albeit indirectly, in the story's disappearance. Trauma, grief, and exhaustion made recounting the full horrors almost unbearable. Many survivors were deeply affected by the loss of family, friends, and community, and some chose silence as a means of psychological survival. Those who did record their experiences often did so years later, producing journals and letters that were scattered, incomplete, or hidden in private collections. Over time, as subsequent generations moved on and settlements shifted, these first-hand accounts became difficult to access or verify, further contributing to the historical amnesia surrounding the disaster. Environmental factors also contributed to the erasure. Louisiana's swampy, unstable terrain made it difficult to maintain permanent settlements or clear records. Buildings and outposts were destroyed by flooding, storms, and the harsh climate, taking with them administrative papers, personal letters, and documentation of daily life. The natural environment effectively swallowed physical evidence of the colony's existence, leaving historians with few tangible artifacts to corroborate the accounts of survivors or colonial records. Social and cultural attitudes of the time further suppressed the story. Many Europeans viewed colonial failures as the natural cost of exploration and empire building, rarely questioning the ethical or logistical decisions that led to mass deaths. In the colonies themselves, the surviving settlers were often marginalized, powerless, or dispersed, leaving no organized group to advocate for the recognition of their experiences. In this context, a disaster that might have been remembered in another society faded into obscurity, its memory relegated to scattered whispers, oral traditions, and obscure archival references. Over the centuries, the combination of censorship, survivor trauma, environmental destruction, and social neglect ensured that the 1720 Louisiana disaster did not enter the broader narrative of American colonial history. Unlike other catastrophic events that were documented, debated, and memorialized, this tragedy was quietly erased. Scholars who later investigated colonial Louisiana encountered fragmented records, contradictory reports, and tantalizing clues. But piecing together a coherent picture required meticulous cross-referencing of ship manifests, personal journals, and European correspondence. Even then, the story remained largely unknown outside specialized academic circles. The disappearance of this disaster from mainstream history also illustrates a broader pattern in the recording of historical events. Human suffering is often omitted when it challenges dominant narratives of progress, expansion, or national pride. In the case of Louisiana, acknowledging the full scale of the 1720 disaster would have exposed not only the limits of European colonial ambition, but also the human cost of prioritizing profit and political prestige over survival. This inconvenient truth was easier to forget, ignore, or suppress. Today, the tragedy of 1720 Louisiana can finally be reconstructed and acknowledged thanks to the careful work of historians and researchers who have pieced together surviving documentation. While the disaster itself cannot be undone, recognizing its scale and human cost restores the voices of those who were silenced for centuries. It reminds us that history is not just about victories and achievements, but also about the forgotten lives that shaped the world in ways both tragic and profound. In the end, the erasure of this colonial catastrophe reflects the fragility of historical memory. Without careful preservation, the suffering of thousands could vanish almost entirely, leaving only fragmented echoes in letters, journals, and the land itself. By revisiting and amplifying these suppressed stories, we honor the lives lost and ensure that the lessons of 1720 Louisiana, the consequences of mismanagement, greed, and environmental unpreparedness, are not forgotten by future generations.